The morning mist clung to the windows of Roosevelt High School like ghostly fingers, creating an ethereal haze that seemed to mirror the uncertainty Kira Thorne felt every time she approached the imposing brick structure. She pulled her oversized burgundy hoodie closer around her slight frame, the fabric worn soft from countless washes and serving as her personal armor against a world that seemed determined to notice her in all the wrong ways. At barely 5 feet tall, with a mass of unruly dark curls that defied every attempt at taming and thick-rimmed glasses that perpetually slipped down her nose, Kira had mastered the art of becoming background scenery in the theater of high school politics. The September air carried the scent of dying leaves and fresh pencil shavings, a combination that should have filled her with the excitement of a new academic year, but instead twisted her stomach into familiar knots of anxiety. 3 months had passed since her family's latest relocation, this time from the rain-soaked streets of Portland, Oregon, to this sprawling suburban maze outside Chicago. And she had yet to feel anything resembling belonging in this place that was supposed to be home. Her father, Marcus Thorne, was a security consultant whose work took their small family across the country like nomads following an invisible compass. Her mother, Sarah, a freelance graphic designer, adapted to each move with the resilience of someone who had learned that home was wherever they happened to unpack their boxes. But for 16-year-old Kira, each relocation meant starting over, rebuilding the careful walls she had constructed around herself and learning the unspoken social hierarchies that governed teenage existence. Roosevelt High was a labyrinth of endless corridors lined with forest green lockers that stretched from floor to ceiling, their metallic surfaces scarred with years of combination locks and frustrated kicks. The main hallway alone could have housed a small aircraft with polished linoleum floors that reflected the harsh fluorescent lighting above and created an echo chamber where every footstep, every whispered conversation, every locker slam reverberated with amplified intensity. Kira had quickly learned to time her movements between classes, navigating the tsunami of students with the precision of a military strategist, always seeking the path of least resistance, the route that would take her from point A to point B with minimal human contact. The library had become her sanctuary, a vast repository of knowledge housed in mahogany shelves that reached toward vaulted ceilings painted with murals of classical literature scenes. Mrs. Henderson, the head librarian, was a kind woman in her 60s whose steel-grey hair was always pulled back in a perfect bun and whose reading glasses hung from a delicate silver chain. She had taken notice of Kira's daily pilgrimages to the furthest corner of the reference section, where outdated encyclopedias created a fortress of solitude that no other student bothered to breach. "Another morning in paradise," Kira muttered under her breath as she approached the main entrance, her worn canvas sneakers squeaking against the damp concrete steps. The early morning crowd was already forming, clusters of students gravitating toward their predetermined social groups with the inevitability of planets orbiting their respective suns. The popular kids claimed the prime real estate near the main doors, their voices carrying across the courtyard with the confidence of those who had never questioned their right to be heard. The athletes gathered near the trophy cases, their Letterman jackets serving as badges of honor that granted them passage through the school's invisible boundaries. The theater kids huddled near the arts wing, their dramatic gestures and animated conversations creating their own pocket of creative energy. And then there were students like Kira, the ones who existed in the spaces between, the shadows and margins, where anonymity provided both protection and profound loneliness. She had almost made it to the safety of the main hallway when she heard the voice that had become the soundtrack to her nightmares. Well, what do we have here?" The words cut through the morning chatter with the precision of a blade, and Kira's stomach immediately dropped to somewhere around her knees. She didn't need to turn around to know that Blake Morrison had spotted her, but some masochistic part of her brain forced her to look anyway. Blake Morrison was everything that Kira was not. A walking advertisement for genetic lottery winners and the kind of effortless confidence that seemed to be distributed unequally at birth. Standing at 6 feet 2 inches with shoulders that stretched his Letterman jacket to its limits, he moved through Roosevelt High's social ecosystem like an apex predator who had never encountered anything resembling a threat. His hair was the color of wheat fields in summer sunlight, perfectly styled in that deliberately messy way that probably took him longer to achieve than Kira spent on her entire morning routine. His eyes were an unsettling shade of green, like sea glass polished by years of getting exactly what he wanted, and his smile held all the warmth of a cobra preparing to strike. Blake had been the undisputed king of Roosevelt High since his freshman year, when a growth spurt and natural athletic ability had catapulted him from relative obscurity to the center of the social universe. He was the starting quarterback on a football team that hadn't lost a home game in 3 years. The kind of student whose name appeared in local newspaper sports sections and whose college recruiters filled the family mailbox with increasingly desperate offers. But beneath the golden boy exterior lay something darker, a need to establish dominance that went beyond the football field and extended into every corner of his daily existence. His entourage consisted of Trevor Walsh and Danny Russo, 2 boys who seemed to exist solely to provide Blake with an audience for his cruelty and backup when his intimidation tactics required additional muscle. Trevor was built like a fire hydrant, stocky and solid with carrot-red hair that clashed violently with his perpetually sunburned complexion and a spray of freckles that covered every visible inch of skin. His hands were permanently clenched into fists, as if he was always prepared for violence, and his laugh was a harsh bark that made Kira think of territorial animals marking their domain. Danny Russo was the opposite of Trevor in almost every way, tall and lean with slicked-back dark hair that he constantly touched and adjusted throughout the day. His olive complexion and sharp features might have made him conventionally attractive, if not for the permanent sneer that twisted his mouth and the calculating coldness that lurked behind his brown eyes. He had perfected the art of the cutting remark, his voice carrying just enough volume to ensure that his victims heard every word while maintaining plausible deniability if confronted by authority figures. Together, they formed a triangle of torment that had made Kira's life at Roosevelt High a daily exercise in psychological warfare and strategic avoidance. They had identified her as prey within days of her arrival, some primitive instinct recognizing her isolation and vulnerability with the efficiency of a pack of hunting wolves. "Look, guys, it's the little mouse," Blake continued, his voice carrying that particular tone of mock sympathy that made Kira's skin crawl. The nickname had stuck from the very first week, when Blake had cornered her near her locker and declared that she scurried around the school like a frightened rodent. Now, 3 months later, even students who didn't know her real name had adopted Blake's cruel designation, turning her identity into a punchline she couldn't escape. Kira forced herself to keep walking, her eyes fixed on the double doors that led to the relative safety of the main hallway, but Trevor stepped into her path with the practiced ease of someone who had blocked many escape routes, his bulk filling the narrow space between a concrete pillar and a group of giggling sophomore girls who immediately fell silent as they sensed the approaching drama. "Still trying to hide in that tent you call a sweatshirt?" Blake asked, closing the distance between them with predatory grace. The hoodie in question had been a gift from her father before their move, purchased from a vintage clothing store in Portland that specialized in oversized menswear from the 1990s. The deep burgundy color had faded to a muted wine shade, and the fabric had developed that perfect softness that only came from years of wear and washing. For Kira, it was more than clothing. It was armor, camouflage, and security blanket all rolled into one. Students began to slow their morning rush, sensing the electric tension that always preceded one of Blake's performances. Kira could feel their eyes on her, dozens of curious gazes drawn to the spectacle like moths to a flame. Some pulled out their phones, already anticipating something worth recording and sharing across social media platforms where humiliation could be replayed indefinitely. "I'm just trying to get to class," Kira mumbled, her voice barely audible above the ambient noise of locker slams and distant conversations. She hated how small she sounded, how the words seemed to get caught in her throat and emerge as little more than a whisper. What was that? Blake cupped his ear in an exaggerated gesture, his performance gaining momentum as his audience grew. "I can't hear you over all that mumbling. Maybe if you didn't dress like a homeless person, people might actually want to listen to what you have to say." The comment hit its mark with surgical precision, and Kira felt heat flood her cheeks as suppressed laughter rippled through the growing crowd of spectators. She had heard variations of this criticism countless times before, not just from Blake, but from the invisible chorus of judgment that seemed to follow her through the school's corridors. The oversized clothes that made her feel safe and hidden were apparently broadcasting her insecurities to anyone who cared to look. Danny snickered, the sound like fingernails on a chalkboard, while Trevor cracked his knuckles with deliberate slowness. The bone-deep pops made Kira flinch involuntarily, a reaction that seemed to energize them like blood in the water energizing sharks. What none of them knew, what nobody at Roosevelt High could have possibly guessed, was that the trembling girl before them possessed skills that could have ended their harassment in seconds. Kira Thorne had been studying Krav Maga since she was 8 years old, when a late-night break-in at their house in Denver had left her parents shaken and determined to ensure their daughter could protect herself. Marcus Thorne had researched self-defense programs with the same methodical intensity he brought to his security consulting work, eventually settling on Krav Maga for its practical, no-nonsense approach to personal protection. "It's not about looking pretty or winning trophies," he had explained to 8-year-old Kira during their drive to her first lesson at a converted warehouse that served as the local training facility. "It's about surviving real situations where someone wants to hurt you. The techniques are designed to be simple, direct, and devastatingly effective." For 8 years, Kira had trained 3 times a week under the tutelage of instructors who treated self-defense as a matter of life and death rather than recreational activity. She had learned to read body language and identify threatening behavior patterns, to create distance when possible and close gaps when necessary, to turn an attacker's strength and aggression against them with the efficiency of redirected physics. Her small frame, which made her an easy target for bullies, was actually an advantage in Krav Maga, where speed and technique trumped size and brute force. She could visualize exactly how she would disable Blake Morrison and his friends. A quick strike to Trevor's solar plexus would double him over, gasping for air. A precise blow to the nerve cluster in Danny's neck would drop him to his knees. And Blake, with his overconfidence and telegraphed movements, would be the easiest of all to neutralize. She could see the exact sequence of moves that would leave him face down on the concrete, wondering what had just happened to his carefully constructed image of dominance. But she couldn't use those skills. Not here. Not against fellow students who, despite their cruelty, posed no genuine physical threat to her life or safety. Her father had been adamant about the appropriate use of martial arts training, drilling into her the difference between self-defense and aggression until the distinction was carved into her moral foundation, like commandments etched in stone. Violence should always be the last resort. Marcus had told her countless times during their evening conversations in whatever city they happened to be calling home that month. Walk away when you can, de-escalate when possible, fight only when you must, when there is no other choice and your life or someone else's life depends on it. So she endured, Day after day, week after week, she swallowed her pride and her training, telling herself that Blake and his friends would eventually grow bored with tormenting her and move on to fresher victims. She convinced herself that high school was temporary, that she could survive anything for a few short years if it meant avoiding the kind of violence that would fundamentally change who she was as a person. She was wrong. The harassment campaign against Kira escalated with the methodical precision of a military operation, each incident carefully calibrated to maximize humiliation while remaining just subtle enough to avoid serious disciplinary action. Blake Morrison had perfected the art of institutional bullying, understanding instinctively how to exploit the gaps between official school policy and practical enforcement. The accidental collisions became more frequent and more violent. Blake would time his approach to coincide with Kira's passage through crowded hallways, his shoulder connecting with hers just as she passed his lockers or emerged from a classroom. The impact would send her stumbling sideways, her books scattering across the floor in a cascade of loose papers and broken pencils, while dozens of students stepped over the debris without acknowledgement. Blake would pause just long enough to offer a mockingly insincere apology before disappearing into the crowd, leaving Kira to scramble on her hands and knees to collect her belongings, while the hallway traffic flowed around her like water around a stone. Trevor specialized in locker ambushes, positioning himself near the industrial grey metal doors that lined the corridors like soldiers at attention. As Kira approached her assigned locker, he would suddenly swing open an adjacent door with enough force to catch her in the shoulder or back, the metallic clang echoing through the hallway like a gunshot. The accidental nature of these encounters provided perfect cover, and Trevor had mastered the art of looking genuinely surprised and apologetic whenever a teacher happened to witness the collision. Danny's weapon of choice was verbal psychological warfare, delivered with the precision of a trained sniper. He had an uncanny ability to identify Kira's presence in crowded spaces and project his voice just loud enough to ensure she heard every carefully chosen word. His commentary focused on her appearance, her perceived lack of social skills, and her obvious status as an outsider, each observation designed to reinforce her isolation and remind her that she didn't belong at Roosevelt High. "Hey, look, it's the charity case," he would announce to his friends as Kira passed their table in the cafeteria. "I wonder if her parents shop at the same thrift store as the homeless people downtown." The cafeteria had become a particularly treacherous battlefield, its vast expanse of round tables and plastic chairs offering no natural cover or escape routes. The room itself was cavernous, with industrial-grade fluorescent lighting that cast harsh shadows and made everyone look slightly jaundiced. The walls were painted in Roosevelt High's official colors of forest green and gold, though years of food fights and general neglect had left them looking more like military camouflage than school spirit. Kira had developed elaborate strategies for navigating lunch periods, timing her entrance to avoid peak congestion and scanning the room like a reconnaissance specialist before committing to any particular route. She learned to identify safe tables in the far corners of the room, usually occupied by underclassmen who were too intimidated by her association with Blake's attention to risk conversation, but also too young to actively participate in her torment. Her typical lunch consisted of a turkey sandwich packed at home, a bag of generic potato chips, and a bottle of water that she could consume quickly if evacuation became necessary. She ate with mechanical efficiency, her eyes constantly moving across the cafeteria landscape to track potential threats and identify escape routes. The social ritual of lunch, which should have been a welcome break from academic pressures, had become an exercise in tactical survival. The day everything changed began like any other Tuesday in November, with the kind of grey, overcast sky that seemed to press down on Roosevelt High like a lid on a pressure cooker. Kira had successfully navigated her morning classes without incident, a small victory that allowed her to approach the lunch period with something resembling cautious optimism. She had managed to claim a table near the emergency exits, a strategic position that offered quick access to multiple escape routes if Blake and his friends decided to make an appearance. She was halfway through her sandwich when Blake's voice boomed across the cafeteria with the authority of a conquering general addressing his troops. "Hey, Mouse!" The words cut through the ambient noise of 400 students eating and talking, causing conversations to pause and heads to turn with the collective precision of a choreographed performance. "Why don't you come sit with us? We promise not to bite." The cafeteria fell into the kind of pregnant silence that precedes either great comedy or terrible tragedy, with every student present understanding that they were about to witness something significant. Kira felt the familiar heat of humiliation flood her cheeks as hundreds of eyes focused on her with the intensity of searchlights, waiting to see how she would respond to Blake's public invitation. Her turkey sandwich suddenly felt like cardboard in her mouth, the taste of processed meat and mayonnaise mixing with the copper flavor of fear that coated her tongue. She could feel her hands beginning to tremble as she set down her food, muscle memory from years of martial arts training causing her body to automatically shift into a defensive posture before her conscious mind caught up with her reflexes. "I'm fine here, thanks," she managed to say, her voice carrying farther than she had intended in the unnatural quiet of the cafeteria. The words came out stronger than she felt, with just enough edge to suggest that she might not be quite as helpless as everyone assumed. Blake's eyes lit up with predatory interest at this hint of defiance, his smile widening to reveal perfectly straight teeth that had been whitened to an almost unnatural brightness. He rose from his seat with theatrical slowness, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. "Oh, but I insist," he said, his voice carrying the mock courtesy of someone who was used to having his requests treated as commands. "Trevor, Danny, why don't you go escort our friend over here?" The two boys flanked Blake like trained attack dogs, responding to a whistle only they could hear, their movements synchronized with the efficiency of long practice. Trevor's stocky frame radiated barely contained violence, his thick fingers curled into fists that looked capable of considerable damage. Danny's lean form moved with the sinuous grace of a snake, his dark eyes calculating distances and angles with the cold precision of a predator sizing up prey. Kira's body responded to the approaching threat with the automatic reactions that had been drilled into her through thousands of hours of training. Her weight shifted to the balls of her feet, her muscles tensing as her brain rapidly processed potential defensive options. She could see exactly how the confrontation would unfold if she chose to engage. Trevor would approach first, his aggression making him the most immediate threat, while Danny would attempt to flank her from the side. Blake would hang back initially, confident that his lieutenants could handle whatever resistance she might offer. She could disable Trevor with a quick strike to his solar plexus, the kind of blow that would leave him gasping on the floor without causing permanent damage. Danny's longer reach would require her to close distance quickly, but his obvious lack of formal training made him vulnerable to basic takedown techniques. And Blake, overconfident and distracted by his audience, would never see the finishing move coming. But even as her body prepared for conflict, her mind pulled back from the brink of violence. These weren't armed attackers breaking into her family's home in the middle of the night. They were teenage boys whose cruelty stemmed from insecurity and social conditioning rather than genuine malice. Using her martial arts training against them would be like using a sledgehammer to swat a fly. Effective, but completely disproportionate to the actual threat they represented. Instead, she grabbed her backpack and hurried toward the cafeteria's main exit, abandoning her uneaten lunch to the cleaning crew that would inevitably bust the table after the drama concluded. The sound of Blake's laughter followed her retreat, echoing off the industrial walls like the howl of hunting wolves celebrating a successful chase. "Run along, little mouse," Blake called after her, his voice carrying the satisfied tone of someone whose dominance had been publicly acknowledged. "Maybe next time you'll remember your place." Kira pushed through the double doors that separated the cafeteria from the main hallway, the sudden silence hitting her like a physical force after the ambient chaos of 400 students eating lunch. The corridor stretched out before her in both directions, lined with lockers and classroom doors that offered potential sanctuary from the humiliation she had just endured. She found refuge in Mrs. Patterson's English classroom, a haven of literature and learning that smelled of old books and the lavender air freshener that the teacher used to combat the institutional odor that seemed to permeate every corner of Roosevelt High. Mrs. Patterson was a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the patient demeanor of someone who had dedicated her career to nurturing young minds through the turbulent waters of adolescence. "Kira?" Mrs. Patterson looked up from her desk with immediate concern as the door opened to admit the clearly distressed student. "Is everything all right, dear?" The classroom was empty except for the two of them, the other students still occupied with their lunch period activities. Afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows that overlooked the school's courtyard, casting geometric patterns across rows of desks that had been arranged with military precision. Posters of famous authors lined the walls, their faces offering silent encouragement to generations of students who had passed through this academic sanctuary. "I'm fine," Kira lied with practiced ease, settling into a desk near the window where she could watch the normal world continue its daily routine beyond the walls of Roosevelt High. "Just wanted to get some reading done before class." Mrs. Patterson studied her for a long moment with the perceptive gaze of someone who had learned to read the subtle signs of adolescent distress through decades of classroom experience. The teacher's expression suggested that she saw through Kira's carefully constructed facade, recognizing the telltale signs of a student under siege, but unsure how to offer help without making the situation worse. "You know, Kira," Mrs. Patterson said carefully, "if you ever need someone to talk to about anything, my door is always open. Sometimes it helps to have an adult perspective on teenage problems." The offer was genuine and kindly meant, but Kira had learned through bitter experience that adult intervention in matters of adolescent social dynamics rarely produced positive results. Teachers and administrators, no matter how well-intentioned, operated within systems of rules and procedures that were easily circumvented by students who understood how to exploit the gaps between official policy and practical enforcement. "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson," Kira replied politely, pulling a worn paperback novel from her backpack and opening it to a random page. "I'll keep that in mind." The teacher nodded and returned her attention to the stack of essays on her desk. But Kira could sense her continued concern, like a warm presence in the otherwise sterile classroom environment. Mrs. Patterson was one of the few adults at Roosevelt High who seemed to genuinely care about her students as individuals rather than statistics in an educational database, but even her compassion had limits imposed by institutional constraints and professional boundaries. The gymnasium presented its own unique challenges, a vast echo chamber of polished hardwood floors and towering ceilings that amplified every sound into thunderous reverberations. Coach Martinez ruled this domain with the military bearing of a drill sergeant, his whistle hanging from a lanyard around his neck like a talisman of authority. Physical education was mandatory for all students, a daily reminder that academic achievement meant nothing if you couldn't navigate the brutal social dynamics of organized athletics. Blake Morrison thrived in the gymnasium environment, his natural athleticism and competitive instincts making him a dominant force in every activity from basketball to badminton. He moved with the casual confidence of someone who had never doubted his physical capabilities. His Letterman jacket replaced by Roosevelt High athletic wear that showed off shoulders and arms sculpted by years of weight training and protein supplements. For Kira, physical education class was 45 minutes of carefully managed survival, a daily exercise in avoiding attention while meeting the minimum participation requirements that would keep her from failing the course. She had learned to position herself strategically during team selections, ensuring that she would be picked last, but not so obviously that coaches would feel compelled to intervene. She participated just enough to avoid disciplinary action, but not so enthusiastically that she might accidentally demonstrate the physical capabilities that her martial arts training had developed. The dodgeball units were particularly treacherous, transforming the gymnasium into a war zone where rubber spheres became projectiles of social warfare. Blake had perfected the art of accidental targeting, his throws carrying enough force to leave bruises while maintaining the appearance of normal competitive play. He would wait until Kira was distracted or off balance before launching his assault, the rubber ball connecting with her head or torso with sickening thuds that left her ears ringing and her vision blurred. "Sorry, Mouse," he would call out with false sincerity whenever one of his missiles found its mark. "Guess you need to work on those reflexes." If only he knew about her reflexes. If only he understood that she could have caught his thrown balls with casual ease, or better yet, caught them and returned them with enough force to knock him flat on his back. Her martial arts training had developed reaction speeds and hand-eye coordination that far exceeded anything required for high school athletics, but she kept these abilities carefully hidden beneath a facade of clumsy incompetence. The locker rooms were perhaps the worst environment of all, spaces where adult supervision was minimal and the potential for humiliation was maximized. The girls' locker room at Roosevelt High was a maze of metal lockers and wooden benches that had absorbed decades of sweat, tears, and whispered secrets. Fluorescent lighting cast harsh shadows across tile floors that were perpetually damp from shower steam and spilled shampoo, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a prison than a place of preparation for physical activity. Kira had developed elaborate strategies for navigating locker room periods, timing her arrival and departure to minimize exposure to potential harassment. She changed clothes with military efficiency, her movements quick and economical as she transformed from civilian attire to gym uniform and back again. She kept her head down and her interactions minimal, understanding that any display of personality or individuality would only provide ammunition for future attacks. But Blake's influence extended even into spaces where he couldn't physically go, his female allies carrying out psychological warfare with the dedication of true believers spreading a gospel of cruelty. Jessica Manning and Brittany Cole were Blake's primary agents in the girls' locker room, two cheerleaders whose own insecurities had been weaponized into tools of torment against anyone who threatened their carefully constructed social hierarchy. Jessica was a petite blonde whose outward sweetness concealed a capacity for casual cruelty that would have impressed medieval torture specialists. She had perfected the art of the backhanded compliment, delivering verbal poison with such apparent sincerity that her victims were left wondering whether they had been insulted or complimented. Her specialty was hiding Kira's clothes while she showered, forcing her to emerge from the steamy sanctuary of the shower stall wrapped in a thin towel to search frantically through lockers and laundry baskets, while time ticked away toward the start of the next class period. Brittany preferred more direct approaches, her harassment taking the form of accidental collisions that would send Kira's carefully organized gym bag spilling across the locker room floor, scattering clothing and personal items across surfaces that hadn't been properly cleaned since the Carter administration. She had also mastered the timing required to slam locker doors just as Kira passed by, the metallic crashes creating percussive soundtracks to her daily humiliation. The incident with the shaving cream had been particularly devastating, transforming Kira's backpack into a foam-filled disaster that ruined textbooks, homework assignments, and the few personal items she carried as talismans against the institutional coldness of Roosevelt High. The cleanup had taken hours, her fingers sticky with mentholated foam as she tried to salvage what remained of her academic materials, and the sweet, artificial scent had lingered for days despite multiple washings. Through it all, Kira remained silent. She cleaned up the messes, replaced her belongings when possible, and tried to convince herself that ignoring the harassment would eventually make it stop. She told herself that bullies fed on reactions, that maintaining her composure and dignity in the face of their attacks would eventually cause them to lose interest and move on to easier targets. But high school social dynamics operate according to different rules than adult conflict resolution, and Kira's stoic endurance was interpreted as weakness rather than strength. Her refusal to fight back only seemed to embolden her tormentors, confirming their belief that she was an acceptable victim who would never pose a threat to their carefully constructed hierarchy of dominance and submission. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon in mid-November when the Illinois autumn had painted Roosevelt High's courtyard in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to mock the gray institutional walls of the building itself. Kira was walking to her locker after biology class, her mind focused on the weekend ahead and the blessed 48 hours of reprieve from Blake's systematic campaign of psychological warfare. She was thinking about the new Krav Maga techniques her instructor had demonstrated the previous evening, complex combinations that required split-second timing and perfect execution to be effective against multiple attackers. David Chen was a third-degree black belt who had emigrated from Taiwan as a child and built his martial arts academy from the ground up through decades of dedication to practical self-defense education. His teaching philosophy emphasized adaptability over rigid technique, encouraging his students to develop instinctive responses that would serve them in real-world situations where formal rules and controlled environments didn't exist. The most important lesson, he had told his advanced class the previous Thursday evening, is knowing when to use these skills and when to walk away. A true martial artist seeks to avoid violence whenever possible, but when conflict becomes unavoidable, we strike with decisive force and end the threat quickly. Kira had practiced the new combination sequences until her muscle memory could execute them without conscious thought, her small frame moving with fluid precision through kicks, strikes, and grappling transitions that could neutralize opponents twice her size. The physical training served as a pressure valve for the emotional stress that built up during her school days, allowing her to channel her frustration and anger into productive skill development rather than destructive fantasies of revenge. She was so absorbed in mentally reviewing the previous evening's training that she didn't notice Blake Morrison and his entourage waiting by her locker until it was too late to retreat. The ambush had been carefully planned, timed to coincide with the end-of-day rush, when hallway supervision was minimal and potential witnesses would be too focused on their own weekend plans to pay attention to whatever drama might unfold near locker number 247. "There she is," Blake announced loudly, his voice carrying the theatrical authority of a ring announcer introducing heavyweight champions, the Invisible Girl herself. A small crowd began to gather, drawn by the electric tension that always preceded one of Blake's public performances. Students pulled out smartphones with the automatic reflexes of a generation that had learned to document every moment of potential viral content, their screens glowing like digital torches in the fluorescent glare of the hallway lighting. Kira approached her locker cautiously, her key ready in her hand and her body automatically shifting into the heightened awareness state that her martial arts training had made second nature. She could feel Blake's presence behind her like a predatory shadow, could sense Trevor and Danny positioning themselves to block potential escape routes with the tactical precision of wolves surrounding wounded prey. "Not so fast, Mouse," Trevor said as her hand reached for the combination lock that secured her locker. His thick fingers wrapped around her wrist with surprising gentleness, a mockery of restraint that somehow made his grip more threatening than outright violence would have been. "Let go of me," Kira said, trying to pull her arm free while maintaining the appearance of helplessness that had protected her for so many months. But Trevor's grip was stronger than she had anticipated, his fingers digging into her skin with increasing pressure that would leave finger-shaped bruises by evening. "You know what I think?" Blake stepped closer, his presence looming over her like a storm cloud gathering strength before unleashing its fury. "I think you're hiding something. Nobody's that much of a loser without a reason." The crowd pressed closer, sensing blood in the water with the instinctive hunger of spectators at a Roman Colosseum. Smartphones were raised like digital standards, recording every moment for later dissection and sharing across social media platforms, where humiliation could be replayed endlessly for the entertainment of strangers. "Maybe she's got scars under that hoodie," Danny suggested with the kind of cruel imagination that came naturally to someone who had made bullying into an art form. "Maybe that's why she covers up all the time." Blake's eyes lit up with malicious interest, his smile widening to reveal teeth that seemed too sharp and too white in the harsh hallway lighting. "Is that it, Mouse? Are you hiding something under there?" Before Kira could react, Blake's hand shot out and grabbed the front of her beloved burgundy hoodie. The fabric stretched and strained against his grip as he tried to pull it upward, his intentions clear to everyone who had gathered to witness her humiliation. Kira's hands flew to her shirt, trying to hold it down and preserve what remained of her dignity, but Blake was stronger and more determined than she had expected. "Stop it!" she shouted, her voice cracking with a combination of panic and rage that surprised even her. "Leave me alone!" But Blake didn't stop. If anything, her obvious distress seemed to fuel his aggression like gasoline thrown on a fire. He pulled harder at the fabric, his knuckles white with effort as he sought to expose whatever secrets he imagined lay beneath her protective layers of oversized clothing. "Come on, Mouse," he taunted, his breath hot against her face as he leaned closer. "What are you so afraid of showing us?" That was when Kira saw her. Emma Rodriguez stood at the edge of the gathering crowd, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of concern and something that might have been admiration. Emma was everything that Kira was not: confident, popular, beautiful in the effortless way that came from good genetics and the kind of self-assurance that money couldn't buy, but seemed to arise naturally from being genuinely liked by her peers. Emma's long black hair fell in perfect waves around her shoulders, framing a face that belonged on magazine covers rather than in high school yearbooks. Her skin was the color of café au lait, smooth and unblemished, despite her complete indifference to the beauty products that consumed so much of her classmates' attention and allowances. When she smiled, which she did often and with genuine warmth, the expression lit up her entire face and seemed to improve the mood of everyone within a 5-foot radius. But Emma Rodriguez was more than just another pretty face in Roosevelt High's student body directory. She was student council vice president, captain of the debate team, volunteer coordinator for 3 different local charities, and maintained a 4.0 GPA while somehow finding time to work part-time at her family's restaurant downtown. She moved through the school's social ecosystem with the rare grace of someone who was genuinely liked and respected by students across all demographic boundaries, from the athletes to the academics to the artists, who usually viewed each other with mutual suspicion and barely concealed contempt. What made Emma truly exceptional, however, was her capacity for seeing people as individuals rather than representatives of whatever social category they happened to occupy. In a high school environment where students were constantly evaluated and categorized according to arbitrary standards of popularity, attractiveness, and social utility, Emma possessed the remarkable ability to recognize the humanity in everyone she encountered. She and Kira had been chemistry lab partners for the past 6 weeks, paired together by Mrs. Hendricks according to some inscrutable algorithm that was supposed to balance academic ability with personality compatibility. What should have been a routine academic assignment had evolved into something approaching friendship, with Emma treating Kira like a real person rather than an unfortunate obligation to be endured for the sake of a grade. "You're really smart," Emma had said during their third lab session as they worked together to balance a particularly complex chemical equation. "I mean, really smart. Have you ever thought about joining the academic decathlon team?" The question had caught Kira completely off guard, not because of its content, but because of the genuine interest and respect that Emma's voice conveyed. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her as an equal rather than a curiosity or a target that she had almost forgotten how normal human interaction was supposed to work. "I don't really do extracurricular activities," Kira had replied, her standard deflection for any invitation that might require her to spend additional time at Roosevelt High or interact with larger groups of students who knew her primarily as Blake Morrison's favorite victim. "That's too bad," Emma had said, her expression suggesting that she meant it. "You'd be great at it. You have this way of breaking down complex problems that makes them seem simple. It's like you can see patterns that other people miss." The conversation had stayed with Kira long after the class period ended, replaying in her mind during the lonely hours she spent in her bedroom, practicing Krav Maga forms and trying to convince herself that high school was a temporary purgatory that would eventually lead to a more meaningful adult existence. Now, as Blake Morrison violated her personal space and dignity while a crowd of students recorded her humiliation for posterity, Emma Rodriguez was pushing through the circle of spectators with the determined expression of someone who had decided that enough was enough. "Blake, stop," Emma said, her voice carrying the kind of natural authority that came from being genuinely respected rather than simply feared. "Leave her alone." Blake's grip on Kira's hoodie loosened slightly as he turned to face this unexpected challenge to his authority. His expression shifted from predatory amusement to something approaching surprise, as if he couldn't quite believe that Emma Rodriguez was inserting herself into what he considered a private matter between himself and his designated victim. "Well, well," he said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that suggested Emma had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "If it isn't the do-gooder princess, this doesn't concern you, Emma." "It concerns me when you're attacking someone who can't defend themselves," Emma replied, her voice steady despite the obvious tension in the air around them. She stepped closer to Kira, her presence providing a kind of moral support that Kira hadn't experienced since the first day she walked through Roosevelt High's imposing front doors. Blake's expression darkened like storm clouds gathering before a tornado, his green eyes narrowing as he processed this direct challenge to his carefully constructed hierarchy of dominance and submission. In his worldview, students like Emma Rodriguez were supposed to remain neutral in matters involving students like Kira Thorne, their social status protecting them from involvement in the messy business of institutional bullying. "You know what, Emma?" Blake said, his voice carrying the silky menace of a cobra preparing to strike. "Maybe you need to learn the same lesson as your little friend here." He released Kira's hoodie and turned toward Emma with obvious malicious intent, his larger frame casting a shadow that seemed to darken the already harsh fluorescent lighting of the hallway. Trevor and Danny shifted position like well-trained attack dogs responding to unspoken commands, their movements designed to prevent Emma from retreating to safety among the crowd of spectators. The assembled students held their collective breath, smartphones trembling in nervous hands as they recorded what promised to be a significant escalation in Roosevelt High's ongoing social warfare. Emma Rodriguez had never been the target of Blake Morrison's particular brand of cruelty, her social status and family connections providing natural immunity from the kind of harassment that less privileged students endured on a daily basis. But now she had voluntarily entered the arena, her intervention on Kira's behalf transforming her from protected observer to legitimate target in Blake's psychological campaign of dominance and control. Emma stood her ground with the kind of quiet courage that Kira had only seen in movies about heroic individuals standing up to impossible odds. Her dark eyes met Blake's green ones without flinching, her chin raised in a gesture of defiance that would have been admirable even if it had been purely symbolic. But Emma Rodriguez wasn't just making a symbolic gesture. She was placing herself between Blake Morrison and someone she had decided deserved protection, fully understanding the potential consequences of her intervention and choosing to accept them anyway. And that was when something inside Kira Thorne finally snapped. Years of training, months of humiliation, and a lifetime of being told to walk away from confrontation suddenly meant nothing in the face of Blake's implied threat against the one person at Roosevelt High who had shown her genuine kindness. The carefully constructed walls that had contained her anger and frustration crumbled like paper barriers in a hurricane, unleashing emotions and capabilities that she had kept buried since her first day at this institution of barely controlled adolescent savagery. "Get away from her," Kira said, her voice carrying a dangerous edge that made Blake pause in his advance toward Emma. The words emerged from somewhere deep in her chest, resonating with the kind of quiet authority that came from absolute certainty about one's ability to follow through on implied threats. Blake turned back toward her with a laugh that sounded forced and artificial, his amusement clearly manufactured for the benefit of his audience rather than arising from genuine entertainment. "Oh, look, the mouse found her voice. What are you going to do about it, freak?" The nickname that had tormented her for months suddenly seemed powerless, a meaningless collection of syllables that bounced off her consciousness without causing pain or humiliation. For the first time since arriving at Roosevelt High, Kira Thorne felt completely centered and in control, her awareness heightened to the point where she could track the movement of individual dust motes floating through the shaft of afternoon sunlight that streamed through the hallway's tall windows. Blake lunged toward her with the overconfident aggression of someone who had never encountered serious resistance, his hand reaching for her hoodie again in a repeat of the violation that had triggered this entire confrontation. But this time, Kira was ready for him. Time seemed to slow as her martial arts training engaged, her consciousness shifting into the hyper-aware state that her instructors had called combat time. She could see the trajectory of Blake's movement with crystalline clarity, could identify the multiple openings in his defense that his arrogance and inexperience had created. His approach was telegraphed and clumsy, the kind of predictable attack that would have been easily countered by even a novice practitioner of Krav Maga. Her hand shot up and intercepted his wrist with surgical precision, her fingers finding the pressure point that her instructor had drilled into her through hundreds of hours of repetitive practice. Blake's eyes widened in surprise and pain as his grip went limp, his nervous system responding to the precisely applied pressure with the automatic reflexes that millions of years of human evolution had programmed into his spinal cord. "What the hell?" Blake started to say, but Kira wasn't finished demonstrating the gap between his assumed dominance and her actual capabilities. She pivoted on her left heel with the fluid grace of a ballet dancer, using Blake's own momentum and body weight against him as she redirected his forward motion into a stumbling sideways trajectory that sent him careening into a bank of lockers with a metallic crash that echoed through the hallway like thunder. The assembled crowd gasped in collective amazement, their smartphones suddenly forgotten as they witnessed the complete reversal of Roosevelt High's established power dynamic. Blake Morrison, the untouchable king of the school's social hierarchy, was standing dazed and confused, while 5'0" Kira Thorne faced him with the calm confidence of someone who had just demonstrated that his reputation was built on carefully maintained illusions rather than actual capability. "I said, get away from her," Kira repeated, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that comes from knowing exactly what you can accomplish and having no doubt about your willingness to follow through on implied promises. Trevor Walsh looked at his fallen leader with confusion and growing alarm, his limited intelligence struggling to process the fact that his intimidating physical presence and reputation for violence had just been neutralized by someone who barely reached his shoulder. But loyalty to Blake and years of pack mentality programming overrode his survival instincts, and he moved toward Kira with the lumbering determination of someone who had never learned to think before acting. Kira read his intentions with the clarity of someone who had spent 8 years learning to identify and respond to aggressive behavior patterns. Trevor's approach was even more predictable than Blake's had been, his movements broadcasting his intentions with the subtlety of a neon sign advertising its contents to anyone who cared to look. When Trevor swung his meaty fist toward her head in a wide overhand punch that would have been devastating if it had connected, Kira was already moving to intercept his attack. She ducked under his extended arm with liquid grace, her body moving in a perfectly executed defensive crouch that positioned her ideally for a counterattack that Trevor never saw coming. Her legs swept out in a perfectly timed arc that caught both of Trevor's ankles simultaneously, disrupting his balance and center of gravity with the mechanical precision of a carefully calculated physics demonstration. Trevor's upper body continued moving forward while his feet were suddenly swept out from underneath him, creating the kind of rotational momentum that sent him crashing to the hallway floor with enough force to knock the wind out of his lungs and leave him gasping like a fish out of water. Danny Russo watched his two companions suffer humiliating defeats at the hands of someone he had spent months dismissing as helpless prey, his calculating mind rapidly reassessing the situation and finding it far more dangerous than he had initially assumed. Self-preservation warred with pack loyalty in his consciousness, and for a moment it seemed as though discretion might prove to be the better part of valor. But Blake's angry shout spurred him into action, and Danny charged toward Kira with the desperate aggression of someone who understood that retreat was no longer a viable option. His approach was faster and more coordinated than Trevor's had been, his lean frame moving with the kind of focused intensity that suggested he might actually pose a legitimate threat. Kira sidestepped his charge with the minimum amount of movement necessary to avoid contact, her body flowing like water around his attack as she grabbed his outstretched arm and used his own momentum to redirect his forward motion into an over-the-shoulder throw that sent him flying through the air with the grace of an involuntary gymnast. Danny hit the hallway floor with a solid thud that reverberated through the institutional tile, his impact creating a percussion effect that seemed to punctuate the complete collapse of Blake Morrison's carefully constructed reign of terror. He lay there for a moment, stunned and winded, before slowly rolling over and pushing himself up on his hands and knees with the careful movements of someone who had just discovered that the world was far more dangerous than he had previously assumed. The hallway fell into complete silence, except for the sound of Trevor's labored breathing and the soft electronic hum of the fluorescent lighting fixtures that lined the ceiling like artificial suns in an underground world. Students stared in amazement at the scene before them, their smartphones now recording the aftermath of what would undoubtedly become Roosevelt High's most legendary moment of social upheaval. Blake Morrison stood against the lockers where Kira's defensive maneuver had deposited him, his perfectly styled hair disheveled and his green eyes wide with a combination of rage, humiliation, and something that might have been fear. For the first time in his high school career, he was facing someone who was not intimidated by his reputation, someone who possessed the skills and confidence necessary to neutralize his advantages and expose the fundamental weakness that lay beneath his carefully constructed facade of dominance. "You little freak," he snarled, pulling back his fist with the desperate fury of someone whose entire worldview had just been shattered by undeniable evidence of his own limitations. "I'm going to destroy you." Blake's punch came faster and harder than either of his companions had managed, driven by genuine anger rather than performative aggression. But speed and power without technique were meaningless against someone who had spent 8 years learning to read, anticipate, and counter exactly these kinds of attacks. Kira leaned back just far enough to let Blake's fist whistle past her face, the air displacement from his missed punch stirring the loose curls that had escaped from her ponytail during the brief but intense confrontation. Before Blake could recover his balance, she grabbed his extended arm and twisted it with the precise application of leverage and joint manipulation that her Krav Maga training had made instinctive. Blake cried out in pain as Kira applied pressure to his elbow joint, forcing him down to his knees with the irresistible physics of properly applied martial arts technique. His face contorted with agony and disbelief as he found himself in a position of complete helplessness, his carefully cultivated image of invincibility crumbling like sandcastles before an incoming tide. "You want to know what I'm hiding?" Kira said, her voice calm and controlled, despite the adrenaline that coursed through her system like electricity through high-voltage cables. "I'm hiding the fact that I could have ended this months ago. I'm hiding the fact that I've been trained to hurt people, and I chose not to use that training because I thought you might eventually grow up and stop acting like a primitive animal defending territory." She applied more pressure to Blake's elbow joint, and his gasp of pain echoed through the hallway like a prayer for mercy from someone who had never shown mercy to others. The assembled students watched in fascination as Roosevelt High's established order of dominance and submission was being rewritten before their eyes by someone they had dismissed as inconsequential. "But you just made a mistake," Kira continued, her voice carrying the kind of quiet certainty that comes from absolute confidence in one's capabilities and moral position. "You threatened someone I care about, and now I'm done pretending to be helpless. I'm done allowing you to hurt people just because you think your size and popularity give you the right to cause pain without consequences." Blake tried to break free from her grip, his muscles straining against the mechanical advantage that proper joint manipulation provided. But Kira's hold was as unbreakable as steel cables, her technique perfected through thousands of hours of practice against training partners who were larger, stronger, and more experienced than the high school bully who was now completely at her mercy. "Please," Blake whimpered, his voice cracking as the reality of his situation penetrated through layers of arrogance and denial. "Please, I'm sorry, I'll leave you alone." The plea hung in the air between them, like a bridge spanning the gap between Blake's assumed superiority and his newly discovered vulnerability. For a moment, Kira felt the dark temptation to make him pay for every humiliation, every moment of fear, every tear she had shed because of his systematic campaign of psychological warfare. She could feel the power flowing through her like water through a dam that was about to burst, the knowledge that she could break his arm with a simple twist of her wrist, could leave him screaming on the hallway floor while the same students who had watched her humiliation now witnessed his complete destruction. The justice would be poetic, the revenge satisfying, and the lesson permanent. But she didn't. Instead, she looked down at Blake Morrison with something that might have been pity, seeing him clearly for the first time as a pathetic and insecure boy whose cruelty stemmed from his own deep-seated fears of inadequacy and rejection. His carefully constructed persona of dominance and control was revealed as nothing more than a desperate attempt to mask his own profound vulnerability. And Kira found that her anger was being replaced by something approaching compassion. "I'm not going to become like you," she said quietly, her voice carrying the moral authority of someone who had chosen mercy when revenge would have been easier and more satisfying. "But if you ever touch me or Emma again, if you ever hurt someone who can't defend themselves, I won't be so merciful next time. Do you understand me?" Blake nodded frantically, his eyes bright with unshed tears of pain and humiliation. "I understand. I won't. I promise." Kira released his arm and stepped back, watching as Blake scrambled backward across the hallway floor like a crab fleeing from an approaching tide. Trevor and Danny were already pulling themselves to their feet, their faces flushed with embarrassment and the kind of bone-deep pain that comes from having your fundamental assumptions about the world proven catastrophically wrong. "Are you okay?" Emma Rodriguez appeared at Kira's side, her dark eyes shining with a mixture of admiration, concern, and something deeper that made Kira's heart skip several beats in rapid succession. "I'm fine," Kira replied, suddenly aware of all the eyes focused on her and the smartphones that had recorded her transformation from victim to victor. The hallway remained unnaturally quiet, as if the entire student body was holding its breath while waiting to see what would happen next in this unprecedented disruption of Roosevelt High's established social order. "That was incredible," Emma whispered, her voice filled with genuine awe rather than the kind of artificial enthusiasm that Kira had learned to distrust during her brief tenure at the school. "Where did you learn to do that?" "My dad taught me," Kira replied, her hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline that continued to course through her system like electricity seeking ground. "He said I should only use it to protect myself or someone I care about." Emma's smile was radiant, transforming her already beautiful face into something that belonged in Renaissance paintings of angels, delivering divine messages to mortal humans. "Someone you care about." Kira felt heat flood her cheeks as she realized the implications of what she had just said, but she found that she didn't want to take back the words or hide behind the protective barriers of emotional distance that had kept her isolated for so many months. "Yeah," she said, meeting Emma's gaze with newfound confidence. "Someone I care about." The crowd began to disperse slowly, students whispering excitedly about what they had witnessed while sharing video footage that would undoubtedly spread through Roosevelt High's social media networks with the velocity of wildfire through drought-stricken forest. But for once, Kira didn't mind being the center of attention, didn't feel the familiar urge to disappear into the background and hope that everyone would forget her existence. The story would spread through the school like a virus, mutating and evolving with each retelling until it bore only passing resemblance to the actual events that had unfolded in the main hallway that Friday afternoon. But the essential truth would remain unchanged. Kira Thorne, the quiet girl who had been dismissed as helpless prey, had revealed herself to be something far more dangerous and far more admirable than anyone had imagined possible. In the days that followed, Roosevelt High felt like a completely different institution, as if the building itself had been transformed by the seismic shift in its internal power dynamics. Blake Morrison and his companions gave Kira a wide berth, their eyes dropping to the floor whenever they encountered her in the corridors that had once been their exclusive hunting grounds. The casual cruelty that had been their trademark was replaced by nervous glances and whispered conversations that died whenever she came within earshot. Other students began approaching Kira with a mixture of curiosity, respect, and in some cases, hope that her example might inspire them to stand up to their own tormentors. Some wanted to know about her martial arts training. Others simply wanted to be associated with the girl who had single-handedly toppled Blake Morrison's reign of terror. She found herself invited to sit at different lunch tables, included in conversations that had previously been off-limits to someone of her social status. But the most meaningful change was in her relationship with Emma Rodriguez, which had evolved from lab partner chemistry into something deeper and more significant than either of them had anticipated. What had started as mutual academic respect had blossomed into genuine friendship, and Kira began to suspect that Emma's feelings might mirror her own growing attraction to the girl who had been willing to stand up to Blake Morrison on her behalf. They spent their lunch periods together in the courtyard when weather permitted, talking about everything from their favorite authors to their dreams for life after high school. Emma had a way of making Kira feel seen and valued, not just for her fighting skills, but for her intelligence, her dry sense of humor, and the quiet strength that had allowed her to endure months of systematic harassment without losing her fundamental sense of self. "I always thought you were interesting," Emma admitted one afternoon as they sat beneath an oak tree that had been planted when Roosevelt High was first constructed in the 1960s. Its massive trunk bore the carved initials of countless students who had sought to immortalize their temporary teenage romances in living wood. "But I didn't know how to approach you. You seemed so guarded, like you were protecting yourself from something." "I was protecting myself," Kira replied, watching a group of freshman students play an impromptu game of frisbee on the grass courtyard that separated the main building from the athletic facilities. "I've been the new kid enough times to know that standing out usually means getting hurt. It's easier to be invisible than to risk becoming someone's target." "But you stood out anyway," Emma pointed out, her perceptive observation cutting straight to the heart of the paradox that had defined Kira's experience at Roosevelt High. "Just not in the way you expected." Kira smiled, thinking about how dramatically her life had changed in the span of a single afternoon confrontation. Her father had always said that sometimes you have to fight for what's right, even when you don't want to, even when it would be easier to walk away and pretend that someone else's suffering isn't your responsibility. The conversation with Blake Morrison came 2 weeks after the hallway confrontation, when the initial shock had worn off, and the social dynamics of Roosevelt High had begun to settle into new patterns that reflected the changed balance of power. Kira was surprised to find Blake waiting by her locker after school, his usual entourage notably absent, and his body language suggesting vulnerability rather than the aggressive dominance that had once been his trademark. "Can I talk to you?" he asked, his voice lacking the arrogant confidence that had once made her stomach clench with anxiety. He looked smaller somehow, as if the revelation of his fundamental powerlessness had physically diminished him in ways that went beyond simple posture and bearing. Kira studied him for a moment, her hand instinctively moving to her backpack strap in a defensive gesture that had become automatic after months of conditioning. But Blake's demeanor suggested contrition rather than aggression, and her martial arts training had taught her to read body language with the accuracy of a polygraph machine. "What do you want, Blake?" she asked, her tone neutral but not actively hostile. "I wanted to apologize," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush, as if he had been rehearsing them, but was afraid he might lose his courage if he didn't speak quickly. "What I did to you, what we did, it was wrong. I know that now." "You know that now?" Kira repeated, her voice carrying a note of skepticism that was entirely justified given the months of systematic harassment she had endured. "You didn't know it was wrong when you were doing it?" Blake's face flushed with embarrassment and what might have been genuine shame, his green eyes unable to meet her steady gaze as he struggled to articulate feelings and realizations that were clearly unfamiliar territory for someone who had spent years insulated from the consequences of his actions by privilege and social status. "I thought," he began, then stopped and shook his head as if rejecting his own attempted explanation. "I don't know what I thought. I guess I liked feeling powerful, and you were an easy target. You were small and quiet and new, and I convinced myself that meant you didn't matter, that hurting you didn't really count because you weren't really a person." The admission was more honest than Kira had expected, and she found herself reassessing Blake Morrison as she listened to his halting attempt to explain the psychology that had driven his campaign of systematic cruelty. He wasn't trying to justify his behavior or minimize its impact, but rather seemed to be genuinely grappling with the moral implications of his actions for the first time in his life. "But seeing you fight back," he continued, "seeing how strong you really are, it made me realize how pathetic I was being. You could have hurt me badly, could have broken my arm or worse, but you chose not to. You showed more strength in that moment of mercy than I've shown in my entire life. Apologizing doesn't undo months of torment," Kira said firmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to demand genuine accountability rather than empty gestures. "It doesn't erase the fear or the humiliation or the nights I went to bed crying because of what you and your friends put me through." "I know," Blake nodded, his acknowledgement carrying the weight of genuine understanding rather than superficial agreement. "I can't take back what I did. I can't undo the damage or make you forget the pain I caused. But I can promise that it won't happen again, to you or to anyone else." Kira considered his words carefully, searching his expression for signs of deception or manipulation, but finding only what appeared to be genuine remorse and a newfound understanding of the human cost of his previous behavior. Blake Morrison was still fundamentally the same person who had made her life miserable for months, but the experience of being completely defeated and humiliated had apparently forced him to confront aspects of his own character that he had previously been able to ignore. "Actions speak louder than words, Blake," she said finally, her tone suggesting that she was willing to give him an opportunity to prove his sincerity, but would not be satisfied with promises alone. "If you really want to make amends, prove it by being better. Prove it by standing up for people instead of tearing them down. Prove it by using your influence to make Roosevelt High a place where students don't have to live in fear of becoming someone's target." "I will," Blake said earnestly, his voice carrying the fervent conviction of someone who had experienced a fundamental shift in worldview. "I promise I will." As Blake walked away, his shoulders slumped with the weight of shame and genuine remorse, Kira felt a complex mixture of emotions that she was still processing weeks later. Forgiveness was not something that could be granted instantly or casually, especially when the wounds were still fresh, and the patterns of fear and anxiety had been carved so deeply into her psychological landscape. But there was something liberating about the confrontation, something profoundly healing about having her pain acknowledged and her strength recognized by the person who had caused so much damage. It didn't erase the past or magically repair the trauma she had endured, but it provided a kind of closure that allowed her to begin moving forward without the constant weight of unresolved anger and resentment. Emma appeared at Kira's side As Blake disappeared around the corner, having watched the exchange from a respectful distance, while remaining close enough to intervene if the situation had taken a dangerous turn. "How do you feel?" Emma asked, her dark eyes reflecting the golden afternoon sunlight that streamed through Roosevelt High's tall windows and painted everything in warm, hopeful colors. "Free," Kira replied, surprising herself with the honesty and accuracy of the single word that seemed to capture something essential about her emotional state. "For the first time in months, I feel free." They walked out of the school together, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the parking lot, where buses waited to transport students back to homes and neighborhoods where they could temporarily escape the complicated social dynamics that governed their daily existence. Kira no longer felt the need to hide beneath oversized hoodies or avoid eye contact with her classmates, no longer experienced the constant low-level anxiety that had made every day at Roosevelt High feel like a military operation requiring careful planning and strategic thinking. She had found her voice, her strength, and something even more valuable. She had found someone who saw her for who she really was, beneath the protective layers of caution and defensive isolation. Emma Rodriguez had been willing to stand up to Blake Morrison on her behalf, had chosen to insert herself into a dangerous situation because she believed that Kira deserved protection and support. As they reached the street that separated Roosevelt High from the suburban neighborhoods where most students lived, Emma slipped her hand into Kira's with the natural ease of someone who had been waiting for exactly the right moment to make exactly the right gesture. Their fingers intertwined with the comfortable familiarity of puzzle pieces finally finding their proper places, and Kira felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun and everything to do with the feeling of being genuinely cared for by someone whose opinion mattered more than the entire population of Roosevelt High combined. "Want to grab some coffee?" Emma asked, her smile carrying the promise of whatever came next in their evolving relationship. "I know this great place downtown where they roast their own beans and the owner makes these amazing pastries that are probably illegal in several states." Kira smiled, feeling the warmth of Emma's touch and the infinite possibilities that seemed to stretch out before them like an uncharted territory waiting to be explored. "I'd like that very much." The story of the quiet girl who had fought back would become legend at Roosevelt High School, passed down through generations of students who heard whispers in the hallways about the day everything changed. Teachers would remember it as the moment when they realized that their students were capable of far more complexity and strength than they had previously imagined. Parents would hear about it secondhand and wonder what other hidden depths their own children might possess beneath the surface personalities they presented to the adult world. But for Kira Thorne, the confrontation with Blake Morrison was never about becoming a legend or inspiring others or proving anything to anyone except herself. It was about finding the courage to stand up for what was right, to protect someone who had shown her kindness, and to refuse to allow fear and intimidation to define the boundaries of her existence. She had learned that sometimes the greatest victories come not from destroying your enemies, but from choosing mercy when you have the power to cause genuine harm. In sparing Blake Morrison when she could have seriously injured him, she had proven that strength and compassion could coexist, that standing up for yourself didn't require losing your humanity or becoming the kind of person who solved problems through violence and intimidation. The bullies had grabbed her shirt and shouted at her, expecting her to cower and submit, as she had so many times before. Instead, she had pushed back against their cruelty with the full force of her training and conviction, and in doing so, had discovered something infinitely more valuable than revenge. She had found herself, her voice, and her place in a world that no longer seemed quite so hostile or indifferent to her existence. Roosevelt High School, would never be the same. And neither would the quiet girl who had transformed herself from invisible victim into someone who could not be ignored, not because she sought attention or recognition, but because she had finally learned to stand tall and face the world with the confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you're capable of when pushed beyond your breaking point.